me on. This case concerns a century-old New York law around a gun regulation called proper cause. Essentially, what this gun regulation says is that you have to have a good reason to want to carry a gun with you into a public space. This type of regulation is called a may issue law. There are 7 states that have may issue laws, and they house a quarter of the US population, and they have some of the lowest rates of gun deaths in the entire country. So this case considered if New York's law was overly inhibiting to gun ownership. The court not only found that it was overly inhibiting and struck down the New York law, but they also ruled more expansively. Justice Thomas, writing for the majority, wrote essentially that the right of people to have a gun in public is true. It expanded a 2008 case called DC v. Heller, which for the very first time in the US's history, after 217 years of jurisprudence that said that the state had absolute authority over who could carry a gun and when, basically said that there was an individual right to gun ownership for the very first time, and that gun right meant that you had a right to have a gun in your home for self-protection. And self-defense. Thomas, in this case, expanded that jurisprudence to say that that is also a right that extends to someone who is in public. Since that 2008 case, we have seen a rise in gun violence. You see castle doctrine. You see stand your ground laws. You see a rise in gun deaths. We are going to see the same thing here. There are going to be more guns in public spaces, and we are going to see more gun deaths. The other issue with this is that probably the biggest and most detrimental aspect of this case was that Justice Thomas ruled that there is a new test to be used when evaluating gun regulations. DC v. Heller established a test that said that there are 2 prongs. The first is, does this regulation have a history and tradition in past gun regulations in this country? Does it fit in with what we've already seen? One would argue that a 100-year-old regulation in New York would maybe stand for that, but apparently it does not. But the other aspect of this test that Justice Thomas got rid of in Bruen was essentially, does this regulation do what it says it does, and will it stop gun deaths? And essentially what this court said, what Justice Thomas said, is that preventing gun deaths doesn't matter. It is just about the history and tradition. And then he spent 30 pages saying exactly what type of narrow history and tradition people are allowed to consider. When judges are allowed to consider when considering gun regulations. It's going to severely inhibit the ability of states to make their own gun regulations based off of the will of their people. 90% of Americans support more universal background checks and more background checks in general. We are seeing broad swaths of the population supporting more gun control legislation, to the point that we actually had our very first gun violence prevention legislation passed in the Senate in almost 30 years. And on that same day, this court backtracked in this way.